The concepts that we have based our protective measures on in the past is a kind of flawed concept now.
The speed that it came in at was ridiculous.
Ireland did have a kind of a near miss. It would have been a catastrophic event.
Our agricultural targets and our climate targets are incompatible in the end of the day.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale.
This is about every single community, every home, every individual changing the way they behave.
The storm season from late 2017 into 2018 was particularly destructive for Ireland. We experienced hurricane wind speeds and flooding, bitter cold and snow, then widespread drought and a scorching summer heatwave. Irish people got a glimpse of the weather extremes that looked likely to become a regular feature of our climate. In early October 2017, the first storm of the season hits, Storm Ophelia.
Good evening and welcome to this 3 News special at 5:30 on the country's severe weather alert. Well, ex-hurricane Ophelia has been lashing the country for several hours now, and a national weather emergency remains in place.
The reason why this is unprecedented or very exceptional, the reason why we're all here today and Met Éireann have issued a status red warning for more than 48 hours notice, is that this storm it's Storm Ophelia, but it is a hurricane.
Behind me, there are 24 fallen trees, 8 ESB poles. The trees came down like dominoes, one after another.
Well, the southeast has been particularly hard hit. Zara King is there, and Zara, Storm Ophelia claimed its first life in Waterford this morning.
Yes, Colette, it is perhaps the human cost of ex-hurricane Ophelia that is being felt most here in the southeast this evening, with the 2 of 3 deaths as a result of that hurricane here in this region.
The power of the storm was undeniable and the loss of life heartbreaking, but emergency services were prepared for the worst thanks to the accurate and timely forecasting by Met Éireann, who took the unprecedented step of issuing a status red warning more than 48 hours before the weather event.
We began monitoring Ophelia about a week before the storm actually arrived. Now, often at that time range, 7 days in advance, the models tend to chop and change a bit, so you're kind of looking for consistency. So on Tuesday the 10th came in seeing the same thing and a little stronger.
This was a rather unusual hurricane in the sense that it wasn't following the track usually into the Caribbean or even into mainland America. In fact, it was going the opposite way towards Europe. It became clear from the National Hurricane Centre warnings that it was taking aim effectively at Britain and Ireland.
Met Éireann made the decision to issue a warning 48 hours in advance, and this was because we had hurricane force winds near Ireland. This was going to be a significant event for Ireland, and so we therefore issued the red warning that we did.
The unprecedented red warning proved to be the correct response, as Storm Ophelia became the worst storm to affect Ireland in 50 years.
I don't know how I would have coped. If anything happened to one of the children, I would have been absolutely devastated. You know, and it's, as you can see, we're going to be here now for a long time, I'd say, with this carnage. But I think only for embedded in the decking, I think it would have come into the house, and I don't think my children would be here today, and that's the truth. It was just, the speed that it came in at it's ridiculous.
There aren't too many storms in Ireland's climatological past you can compare Ophelia to. In fact, you have to go back as far as ex-hurricane Debbie in September 1961 to find something similar to Ophelia. Debbie kind of struck very suddenly and unexpectedly in an era before satellite and computer technology, whereas Ophelia, with our current technologies, we were able to successfully forecast its arrival 5 days in advance.
The National Emergency Coordination Group will be meeting 3 times a day during the course of the day, and obviously this is an evolving situation. We will see how things develop, but government is poised, resourced and ready to respond in any way necessary.
Despite the authorities' best efforts, they were at the mercy of the storm. Ophelia raged for just 2 days, but it took weeks to repair the damage.
An unprecedented 385,000 homes and businesses were left without power, largely as a result of trees falling on power lines at the height of the storms yesterday. It's a massive challenge for ESB networks, who say that between 5 and 10% of those customers can expect to be without power for up to 10 days.
And while repair crews made progress, others were counting the human cost.
Around 20 to 12 this morning, a woman in her 50s was driving along the Aglish to Clashmore Road when her car was struck by a fallen tree and she was killed.
You know, they're all complaining about houses and roofs and trees, but with the O'Neill family, what they've gone through now, it's very easy to fix what's gone wrong, you know, but you cannot fix that.
Another worrying characteristic of Storm Ophelia was the fact that it travelled to Ireland at all. Our cold waters and strong winds usually act as a buffer against the Atlantic's hurricane season, but Ophelia was different.
There are very few hurricanes that actually travel in that direction. I think it was the deepest eastward hurricane on record. And what was exceptionally rare about this one was that it was taking a track right into along the eastern Atlantic. Presumably, in the past, this would have been entering relatively cold water. But in this case, in October, it was maintaining its hurricane characteristics almost to the point at which it made the coast of Kerry.
It wasn't your typical common or garden hurricane. It kind of formed in an area where hurricanes don't usually form. And it was basically due to the fact that the sea temperatures in that part of the Atlantic were higher than normal. And then it went a little bit southwards, got more energy from warm seawater, and then that's why it came towards Ireland. And in a changing climate, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that a similar thing could happen again.
While Ophelia gave Ireland a mild taste of hurricane season, our Atlantic neighbours in the US were in the middle of a particularly devastating storm season. Just a month before Ophelia hits our shores, the Caribbean is faced with the destructive power of a Category 5 hurricane.
The hurricane season in 2017 was perhaps not the most active one on record, but certainly the most damaging one on record. And it was particularly damaging because of a whole sequence of hurricanes which came in a row. There was Irma, there was Jose, there was Maria, and all of them were really Category 4 or Category 5 hurricanes. Maria came after Irma, which had devastated a lot of the Caribbean. And I really, as I watched Maria develop, it was kind of clear it was going to be a major problem for some of the poorer Caribbean islands. We now know that something like 3,000 people died, although at the time President Trump was estimating that only 64 people had died. It was only appreciated in the US just how bad the storm had been, but it was a Category 5, and Category 5 hurricanes really are among the most destructive things you can get on this planet.
It hit Dominica, I think, at a Category 5, passed over Dominica and then through to Puerto Rico as a Category 4 and did cause catastrophic damage. It wasn't actually the strongest hurricane that season. Hurricane Irma was. Hurricane Irma was a Category 5, also a Cape Verde hurricane, and it made 4 Category 5 landfalls in the Caribbean. One of the things that struck me when I went to the National Hurricane Centre, I met a girl from Barbuda which had had one of those Category 5 landfall of Irma. I asked her, what was it like? And she basically said to me, well, I wasn't there. In fact, nobody lives on my island anymore.
As Donald Trump visits Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, climate scientists and researchers can't help but be reminded of his actions just 3 months earlier when he pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord.
The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States. As president, I have one obligation, and that obligation is to the American people. The Paris Accord would undermine our economy, hamstring our workers, weaken our sovereignty, impose unacceptable legal risk, and put us at a permanent disadvantage to the other countries of the world. It is time to exit the Paris Accord.
We all saw it coming, people that are following American politics. We all knew that Donald Trump was a climate change denier. We know where the position of the GOP leadership is on the issue. We know that what position the donors of these candidates have. It's one of the cheapest policy positions that he could deliver on. Well, the United States is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. That type of an emitter not participating actively in the global framework and the global agreement on emissions reductions will have a detrimental effect on progress. This is just pure politics. Coal has no future in the economy, and so the fact that you see Donald Trump or other Republicans or other politicians for that matter try to support and buttress this industry, we can only attribute it to electoral incentives.
The initial reaction was, this is awful, this is terrible, the world's second largest greenhouse gas polluter is pulling out of the Paris Treaty. But I went to the conference of the parties in Marrakesh immediately after that, and it was quite stimulating to see that, in fact, far from derailing the Paris Agreement, I think Trump's actions have given it some impetus.
Regardless of the effect that Trump's action had on the scientific community, the effects of Hurricane Maria on the residents of the coastal US were more pressing as the death toll continued to rise. Here in Ireland, we can only imagine the power of such a storm. Ophelia gives a sense of a hurricane's power. When the storm made landfall, a wind gust of 155.6 kilometres per hour was recorded in County Cork. If that wind speed had been sustained, it would have made Ophelia a Category 2 hurricane. Hurricane Maria has sustained winds at nearly double that speed. As our climate changes, it begs the question, could a storm of that magnitude make its way to Ireland?
Because it forms only over the ocean, a hurricane is dependent on the temperature of the ocean. And for that reason, we don't get them in Ireland, because our ocean waters very seldom get to that kind of, well, they never get to that kind of value. And Ophelia was kind of a landmark hurricane, perhaps a harbinger of things that we may experience in the future more often as the ocean warms up and as there's more energy going into the ocean from our warming of the atmosphere.
As the Caribbean and the east coast of the US continue to battle with a surging hurricane season, back home, and just weeks after Ophelia, Ireland was hit by Storm Brian.
It wasn't as strong as Ophelia, but it still, packed a punch. And so soon after Ophelia, having another event like that, it did hamper efforts to recover in the aftermath.
While Storm Brian lacked the power of Ophelia, it did highlight the fact that while individual storms may not be particularly devastating by themselves, when they hit in quick succession, the effects can be overwhelming.
Well, winter storms give us problems in Ireland when they occur in sequence, because often the ground is saturated when the next storm arrives, so there's nowhere for the water to go. What I think we have to realise are two things about the fact that our Irish climate is changing. And the first is that the concepts that we have based our protective measures on in the past, the concept of the once-in-a-century storm or the once-in-a-century event, is a kind of flawed concept now. So I think what we will learn from these events is that places which never flooded are now going to be vulnerable to flooding in the future, and places where there are histories of flooding, the flooding is likely to be more severe in the future. We have plenty of opportunities in Ireland to build houses in places which are not vulnerable to flooding. We know from our historic maps, from the 6-inch maps of the 19th century, which have all marked the areas liable to flooding, that it doesn't make sense to build houses there. If they flooded in the past, you can be quite sure they'll flood in the future.
Good evening. The country has been warned to prepare for extreme snow and blizzard conditions not seen in this country for almost 40 years.
As 2018 began, it seemed winter would never end. And as we eagerly awaited the arrival of spring, we got something completely different instead. A visitor from Siberia.
Good evening. The country has been warned to prepare for extreme snow and blizzard conditions not seen in this country for almost 40 years. The so-called beast from the east is heading our way from Siberia and is set to collide with another weather system moving up from the southeast.
the beast from the east is coming our way, where advice is issued in relation to workplaces and travel, that will be clear. And we'll either be asking people to stay at home and not make unnecessary journeys, or if they're in work already, to stay in work and not make unnecessary journeys.
Rapidly, things began to go downhill.
I actually don't think I've ever been as cold covering any story in all my time.
The countryside is literally just a blanket of snow.
We're in Terminal 1 at the moment. It is deserted. There's nobody here on the ground floor.
The beast from the east was a prolonged period of easterly winds which brought air from Siberia across Ireland. And what was unusual was that at the same time as that cold air was established over Ireland, the ordinary Atlantic depressions were beavering away out in the Atlantic. And one in particular was coming from quite far south.
That storm was called Emma, and it was on a collision course with the beast from the east.
Emma brought with it a lot of moisture. So when this moisture interacted with the cold air streaming in from the east, it turned all of the moisture that Emma brought into snow and kind of developed this snow cannon effect over the southeastern half of the country, which is where we saw the heaviest accumulations of snow.
I think we've got some breaking news from the National Emergency Coordination Centre, where our political correspondent Gavin Riley is standing by. Have you bad news for us, Gavin?
It's particularly bad news, Colette, for people that are based in the southeast of the country. Earlier in this 3 News special, we've been telling people about how the red weather warning has been extended for 5 counties on the eastern seaboard: Dublin, Meath, Kildare, Wexford and Wicklow. Effectively, Met Éireann is now warning of massive, significant incoming snowfall in those particular counties.
The country ground to a halt and the snow continued to fall. It was a reminder that extreme weather is sometimes not a product of a single powerful storm, but a combination of weather events.
And that's part of what extremes are. When things go wrong in Ireland's climate, it's not usually one thing that goes wrong, it's usually a combination of things. In this case, it was the depression plus the beast from the east, and we saw what that produced.
The snow caused travel chaos and school closures, with many businesses forced to close their doors. One unexpected result of the snow was the bread crisis.
People were told yesterday by Met Éireann to stock up on essentials, and the bread shelves are empty, so certainly people are taking those warnings very seriously.
After 3 days of the worst weather the country has seen in 4 decades, the thaw is finally kicking in, but counties like Wicklow aren't out of the woods just yet.
As the snow disappeared, we were left asking, would we be better prepared next time?
We have to have a happy medium between what we spend our taxpayers' money on and what kind of events we can expect to occur with certain frequencies. I think if it was to happen again, we probably would be a bit better prepared, but not much better prepared. I think it's part of our psyche that we don't really anticipate these events till they happen.
But as the year moved on, and with snow still fresh in our minds, another extreme.
So just a few months later, Ireland was in the grip of a heat wave, and interestingly and quite surprisingly in some ways, the same easterly flow that gave us the beast from the east also caused the heat wave. This summer in Ireland was one of the hottest and driest summers that we've had, possibly since 1976. Certainly at the Phoenix Park, it was the driest summer since 1995, and the second driest summer since records began at the Phoenix Park, which started in the mid-1800s.
It's far away from the snow we are now, though. We suffered all last winter and everything, so it's nice to be out, lovely to be out.
Yeah. It may be a problem now for the farmers with irrigation and that, but certainly here in the city, I say we're going to soak it up.
So we had temperatures up to 32 degrees centigrade, for example, which was the highest temperature ever recorded at an Irish synoptic station.
Irish Water is extending its hosepipe ban to the entire country. The national outlawing of unnecessary water use will come into effect on Friday morning next until the end of the month.
I have never experienced anything like it. I arrived in Fenord in 1964, and this is the first time.
We can anticipate now that recovery of water supplies is not something that will happen with the first rains. In fact, it could take weeks of rain before we get to a position where rivers and groundwater levels start to recover.
We are all aware of the drought that we experienced and the water restrictions we had in the country. In fact, all of the stations within Met Éireann's synoptic network, apart from one station in Finner, County Donegal, had less rainfall than the average. It was the only one in the entire network that had its average rainfall. All of the rest of them were below average rainfall.
And while the high temperatures and lack of rain were perfect for sun worshippers, conditions were also right for gorse fires, the intensity of which caught some motorists by surprise.
Of course, it had knock-on effects in that we all saw the grass dying, we saw the problems of fodder emerging, fodder supply emerging, and we saw that while this was very good for urban dwellers who wanted to go to the coast and enjoy the summer, it wasn't such good news for people trying to grow things in their fields.
With absolute drought conditions recorded at 21 synoptic stations across Ireland, the heatwave hit farmers hard.
This field in North County Dublin belongs to Keogh's farm. They grow potatoes here and they also make crisps. And like many other farmers around Ireland, they're struggling to deal with the warm weather.
It's been a complete struggle. We're into the third week now of very dry for us, and we've been hoping for a bit of rain to come. I'm losing the battle here.
I travelled to both Limerick and Tipperary to meet dairy farmers who were hit particularly hard during the summer's drought.
We spent 3 months feeding our silage. There was no rain here for 3 months of any significant amount. We went from having to buy silage in the springtime to make up for the snow and the long winter, to having to feed out our first cut silage in the summer to keep the cows going. We had at least 40 acres here completely burnt that grew nothing for 3 months. So this winter will be very tight, because I had to feed out at least a third of the silage I made, but it'll be hard in the pocket, but we'll budget to get through it.
The first rain we got was actually in September. Like we had on the 20th of June, I introduced silage into the diet, and on the 7th of July, I had the cows on a full winter diet. I just had no grass. Grass stopped growing. We completely burnt up. This year kind of was a bit of a nightmare between the spring being so bad and having to leave the cows in, and then the drought being so bad, having no grass for the cows to feed the cows was tough. Anything that kind of could have went wrong in the spring and summer, it did go wrong, and it just put pressure on the farmer itself. Like the one thing that was kind of good, not kind of good, but everyone was in the same boat. You know, if you rang a friend up the road, you're like, Jesus, I'm up shit creek without a pedal. Everyone was in the same boat together. We just got hit with both fists, kind of thing. Yeah.
There's a well-known problem of grass growth when the temperatures get to that level and when the rain doesn't come. And it was quite clear from early June that there was going to be a problem in terms of getting the second silage cut for farmers. That's partly a reflection also, of course, that we have 750,000 more cattle in Ireland than we had 6 years ago. So in many cases farmers were grazing those cattle on lands which they might have been growing fodder on 5 or 6 years ago. And this compounded the problem. Farmers were much more vulnerable this year to the drought than they would have been in former years when there was less pressure on the land in terms of grazing.
However, farmers are being asked to put more pressure on the land, and as a result being exposed to greater risk when extreme weather events happen. Part of the problem is a conflict at policy level. As the EU pushes sustainability and low-carbon agriculture, our government is encouraging increased production of our biggest export, food.
By 2020, we need to be producing more milk. And then they're also saying by 2020, you need to be down on emissions. Now, whether the way to do it, I haven't the answers now.
This is where the conflict with Harvest 2020 and the conflict with Foodwise 2025 comes in. The constant intensification is running up against the climate problems, and I think that has to be recognised. Our agricultural targets and our climate targets are incompatible in the end of the day.
And it's this incompatibility that's putting farmers under increased pressure. As the world population grows and a diet heavy on meat and dairy becomes the norm, farmers are being asked to increase production while at the same time reduce emissions. Goals that seem at odds with each other. They are being asked to produce greater quantities at a lower price with a carbon footprint that's lower still.
Farmers are stuck in a hard place at the moment. We're basically between two rocks. On one side you have the department telling you we have to meet our emission targets or your carbon targets. But on the other side then you have the abolition of quotas. You have farmers told you can up your production, up your scale, increase your herds. How do you know which way is the sustainable way to go? Whether you're told to produce more for a growing market and more people that need to be fed, or do you have to decrease what you have and try and produce the same amount? I don't think it's possible.
As the battle between emissions and production at farms across the country rages on, inevitably it'll be consumers that pay the price.
If we have to meet these targets and production is dropped to meet these targets, in my mind, the only fair thing is that the price goes up. And on a consumer point, you might have to pay a bit more for the product, but you're getting a first-class product that is produced in this country and not being brought in.
We can't afford to have a world that develops with the same kind of dietary habits that we've developed in the Western world. One hopes that the population of the world goes through the demographic transition to a low birth rate quicker than it is at the moment, and that to me is a race against time. Will the population of the world stabilise before the climate of the world is completely wrecked?
Yeah, I don't believe it. You don't believe it? No, I don't believe it.
There is agreement across the scientific community that our climate is changing and that human action is responsible for the change. And although there are detractors, research suggests that 97% of scientists agree on the facts surrounding climate change and its cause.
Let's actually talk about that figure, the 97% figure that goes around when we talk about overwhelming agreement amongst climate scientists. Actually, my colleague John Cook at George Mason University was leading a study that found that it's 97% of scientists agree overwhelmingly that climate change is happening and that it is attributed to human activity, so it's anthropogenic, and that the impacts are going to be extreme if we don't do anything to curb the cause of the issue, which is emissions, greenhouse gas emissions.
The climate change science is now settled. There's very little room for saying that humans are not causing climate change anymore.
The debate now among scientists is how bad will it be when we get to a certain level of warming? Will there be knock-on effects? Will there be thresholds that have been passed?
The modelling we've done on Maynooth suggests that we will have another half degree or so of warming in the next 30 years here in Ireland, and that's very much in line with what we expect to happen globally as well. I think it's very unlikely that we will suddenly see a halt to global warming in the next 20 to 30 years. Even with a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, we have a certain commitment in the atmosphere which we will have to adapt to. It will be very hard for us to avoid warming by 1.5 degrees unless very radical measures are taken. And a business as usual, if you like, trajectory would take us through that critical 1.5 degree value sometime in the next 12 to 20 years. That's very serious as a conclusion because it means that we have very limited time to address this problem. Otherwise we hand the problem on to another generation who will have even less options available to them to tackle the problem than we have.
Not only is time against us, there is a growing counter-movement of climate change scepticism with deep pockets and a wide reach. This movement is actively working to suppress mainstream climate science.
This climate skeptical or skepticism movement, or the counter movement as it's called, is a counter movement to the environmentalist movement that originated in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. It was later on that we started to see efforts, organized efforts to counter environmental policies, be it anti-pollution or Clean Air Act or other policies enacted by the government. It follows the denial machine playbook, right? So you have organized interest groups that are funding organizations, be they front groups or AstroTurf organizations, these are pseudo grassroots organizations, or conservative think tanks that are coordinating to disseminate misinformation. The objective is to change the minds of voters, change the minds of policymakers so that policy is obstructed. This misinformation is then filtered into an echo chamber where we have the blogosphere, we have websites, we have politicians that will then take that information or that misinformation and echo those positions.
One politician in particular is known for echoing the climate denial argument. He often takes to Twitter to make his opinion known and peddle his own brand of climate change denial.
Climate change denial has different flavors, follows different paths. The arguments are as follows. Climate change is not happening. Or if it is happening, humans aren't causing it. Or even if humans are causing it, there's not much we can do about it. Or it's not happening and it's actually all a hoax, right? So this is more or less the playbook or the flavors of denialism that we find. The next question is, do they actually have an impact on the policymaking process? And there is a lot of research actually suggests that indeed the money actually translates into policy. The deep pockets really do matter.
We will unlock job-producing natural gas, oil, and shale energy. We will produce American coal to power American industry. We will transport American energy through American pipelines made with American steel. Made with American steel. Can you believe somebody would actually say that?
Climate denial is clearly having an effect in climate policy, particularly in the US, and it's a frustrating development for climate scientists around the world.
I would hope that the climate skeptic community, which in the past has been, of course, very well funded by fossil fuel interests and still gets a bit of moral support from them at times, I would hope that they would realise that they are effectively undermining the next generation's opportunities for sustainability. The climate skeptic community is one which I thought would disappear after the last IPCC assessment report. But it has continued to rumble on, and there is an element of it here in Ireland as well, which seeks to undermine the scientific reality of climate change. What annoys me in a sense is that, you will hear climate skeptics using the words I believe or I don't believe. And climate change is not a matter of faith, it's not a matter of belief. You're arguing with thermometers. And, anyone that wants to argue with thermometers really, I think, needs to get a grip on themselves a bit more.
And here's what the thermometers are saying. Since 1901, the planet's surface has warmed by around 1 degree Celsius per century. But the rate of warming has nearly doubled since 1975, and the 4 warmest years on record have all occurred since 2014. Although the average temperatures are rising, warming hasn't been uniform across the planet, and when the weather turns particularly cold, Donald Trump uses Twitter to ridicule scientists and politicians who take a position in support of global warming, suggesting it's getting colder in parts of the world, not warmer. And he's right, but for the wrong reasons. If you look at Ireland's big freeze in March of this year, it was caused in part by unseasonably warm weather in the Arctic. And as human activity pumps more energy in the form of heat into the atmosphere, we can expect more extreme weather. The question is, will the frequency of extreme events have any sway on the climate skeptics?
There's no question that these people will continue to deny the existence of climate change or the human impact on the changing climate. Unfortunately.
John, go ahead. I've seen it. I've read some of it, and it's fine. Yeah, I don't believe it. You don't believe it? No, I don't believe it.
One of the reasons the denial machine has gathered momentum is the scale of the problem. As individuals, we can often feel powerless to make any significant impact on climate change. The problem is simply too big, and the people preventing meaningful climate action are simply too powerful.
There's a lot actually that individuals can do, even if it's small things like changing a light bulb to more energy efficient LED light, for instance, has actually a non-trivial impact on emissions. If we all did it, for instance, eat a little bit less meat, that has an impact. Make sure that our homes are more energy efficient.
We have to focus on policy change as setting the ground rules. One of the things that politicians frequently say is that nobody at the doorstep ever raised this issue with them, and of course it's true. People do not raise long-term issues at the doorstep with politicians. They're more concerned with short-term issues as, education or health or fixing the roads. But I think we need to now alert our politicians to the fact that people are concerned about this topic in a way that perhaps the politicians have not appreciated before.
Sunny day out there. I was recently in a primary school in my own constituency, and there were children as young as 4 and 5 who were very alert to the challenges of sustainable development, the type of environment we're going to create for the next generation. I suppose if you talk to people who are much more mature, you probably don't have the same sense of urgency, and I think that is a real challenge. I recognise that there will be some sectors of industry and farming and others where the burdens will be particularly difficult. There will be difficult changes to be made, and I think we have to recognise those and try to assist those. But what's absolutely crucial is we can't say, I'm opting out of this, because this is a truly global challenge. All of us must engage, and we must find the least cost, the least disruptive ways of delivering what are huge obligations we must meet.
And that's a sentiment echoed by one of the world's best-loved naturalists and filmmakers. At the UN Convention on Climate Change, David Attenborough delivered a stark warning.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon.
I have witnessed many fires in my community and personally experienced the devastation of those fires up close and personal, but none as catastrophic as the events that have taken place in our community these past 5 days and nights.
As the year rolled on, storm season continued to wreak havoc. In September, Storm Ali hit Ireland, a powerful storm that caught many unawares. During the storm, 2 people lost their lives.
Good evening. The full devastating impact of Storm Ali is being laid bare this evening. The violent winds that lashed the country since early this morning have been responsible for 2 deaths, one in County Galway, the other in County Armagh.
I'm currently here on the Mona Vey Road in Galway. Just behind me.
One of the reasons Ali caught people by surprise was because it arrived on our shores suddenly, hidden behind another storm, Hurricane Helene.
Helene was a hurricane that the National Hurricane Centre was tracking for a number of days in mid-September, and all the indications were that Helene wasn't going to be a very significant event for Ireland. And all the time before that, we were watching what was coming behind Helene. And certainly there was some model guidance evidence to suggest that we could be in for a very stormy period in the aftermath of Helene. Ali was kind of hidden behind Helene, and one of the issues with mid-latitude storms is that they occur very, very quickly. They form very, very quickly, and they move very, very quickly, and then they're gone. So you're looking at a very extreme event happening in a very short space of time, and you hardly have time to breathe before it's on your doorstep.
Ali highlighted one of the major challenges for Met Éireann and forecasters internationally, getting their message across to the public.
We are the authoritative voice on weather within Ireland, and we have to ensure that the message of be prepared, be alert, be safe, something significant is coming, is perhaps the greatest challenge that we are facing, that we will continue to face into the future.
Nowadays we are vying for people's attention, and it's just about making sure that we get that message out there to the people who need it.
Even when the message is clearly communicated, frustratingly, it is sometimes ignored. A month after Ali, another storm, Callum, arrives on our shores.
I've seen worse, but we're used to it now at this stage.
There was no loss of life or particularly devastating damage, but at Met Éireann, forecasters knew Callum was a near miss.
Storm Callum went northwards towards Iceland, and had Storm Callum come in across Ireland, it would have been a catastrophic event. Like, it was a very deep and very impressive system, but in some ways Ireland did have a kind of a near miss in that it went northwards towards Iceland, but we did still get some very strong and gusty winds off it.
While hurricane season continued to drive wild weather towards Ireland, across the water, the US were struggling with the relentless onslaught of powerful storms.
Hurricane Florence showed how dangerous a tropical system can be. Tropical systems carry a lot of water, and in some ways it doesn't really matter what category the storm is. If it's a tropical storm and it's slow moving, it's going to dump a lot of water, and that's what happened with Hurricane Florence. It went in the Carolinas, became slow moving, and caused huge damage. I think it's often misunderstood, but actually the biggest killer in a hurricane is water from storm surge, rainfall and mudslides.
Shortly after Florence, another hurricane, Michael, hits Florida.
The emotional toll of a hurricane, the aftermath is what gets you, because you gotta survive the rest of this.
Throughout the year, we have seen weather extremes in the form of record storms, heat waves, floods and droughts. And in California, another extreme, wildfires.
All the stuff that we had grown up with for years, our landmark restaurants and stuff like that, they're gone just totally in one day. The whole town basically was just wiped off the map, to look at it that way.
Over 80 people died in the fires, and many more are unaccounted for.
Our hope is that if there are missing people, we can find them and bring some closure to people that need that.
In the ashes, we can see the fingerprint of climate change. Records show that over the last 20 years, California has become hotter and drier, and that's driving a trend towards larger fires. It's a trend that some of the state's most famous residents have recognised.
I have witnessed many fires in my community and personally experienced the devastation of those fires up close and personal, but none as catastrophic as the events that have taken place in our community these past 5 days and nights.
When we reflect on a very challenging storm season, we can't help but ask what role climate change plays in extreme weather. It's a difficult question to answer, but one that is looking more certain.
The science of attribution, as it's called, has moved on very considerably in the past 5 years. What we can now do with our models is we can run them not once, but maybe 100 times, and we can run them with and without carbon dioxide loading in the atmosphere. And we can say, well, how much of a probability does that event have when we have CO2 in the atmosphere as opposed to not having CO2 in the atmosphere? And this gives us a handle on saying that almost every extreme event now will have a certain fingerprint which is caused by human action. We can see the march, if you like, of the temperature graph going on to make human-induced causes of extreme events much more likely in the future.
It seems certain that extreme weather events are going to become more common in Ireland, but are we doing enough to try and limit the damage? Many experts would argue we aren't, and point to our recurring issues with flooding.
What we will learn from these events is that places which never flooded are now going to be vulnerable to flooding in the future, and places where there are histories of flooding, the flooding is likely to be more severe in the future. We have plenty of opportunities in Ireland to build houses in places which are not vulnerable to flooding. We know from our historic maps the areas liable to flooding. If they flooded in the past, you can be quite sure they'll flood in the future. We're not an island which has historically experienced the kind of extremes of weather that we get, for example, in the tropics. But we're seeing, I think, some of those extremes becoming more frequent now. And I think we have to take them as a warning that the model predictions which we've been making for the past 20 years are now coming home to roost. We have to take the warning seriously, and we have to play our part internationally. It's no good saying Ireland is just too small a country to worry about, let other countries worry about it. It behoves us, I think, to play our part in Europe and take seriously our responsibilities that we have signed up to in terms of both the United Nations, Paris Agreement, but also our EU obligations as well, which we are now very much in breach of.
An effective climate action plan can't be just written in Merrion Street or Adelaide Road. This is about every single community, every home, every individual changing the way they behave. I think we have to recognise that each one of us has to think about the climate choices we make. And though we're a small country and our overall contribution may not be huge, it's absolutely vital that we show leadership in this area.